So I'm delighted to introduce an accomplished panel for today's seminar titled Opening the Black Box, the Rise of the Rehabilitation Treatment Specification System. And of course, the panel is familiar to most, but just in case there's newcomers on the call, Dr. Mary Ferraro is an occupational therapist and coordinator of the OT Fellowship in Physical Rehabilitation. She's the peer review committee chair internally here and an active member of the Moss Rehab's Motor Control Analysis Lab. Andrew Packel is the physical therapist, a neurologic clinical specialist and locomotor coordinator at Moss Rehab and an experienced and valued clinician. John Whyte, Dr. Whyte is an Institute Scientist Emeritus, co-founder and former director of the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute. The work of this panel and their collaborators on the RTSS is arguably transformative to the entire field of rehabilitation medicine that has really been plagued by imprecisely defined treatments. And certainly this work is having national, if not international impact. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I'm going to start us off. I'm Andy Packel, and we're going to get right into it. So we appreciate the support of the Shrier family in supporting the talk. And we have, in terms of disclosures, neither the planning committee nor the presenters have any financial relationships to disclose. So we're going to get into some learning objectives. I'm going to start off in talking about some background and key concepts related to the RTSS. And we're going to hear from Mary Ferraro, or excuse me, from John Whyte first about how RTSS might be used in terms of communicating research evidence and putting that into practice. And then Mary Ferraro will talk about some benefits of the RTSS for clinical reasoning used in the clinic and also for clinical education. So we wanted to make everyone aware that this isn't something that, the three of us sat down at lunch over last week and came up with this system. That it's been work that's been going on for, for a good 15, 20 years. It was first formalized with the NIDLR cooperative agreement shown there in 2008 from 2000 to 2013. Marcel Dykers was a rehabilitation researcher at Mount Sinai. Was the principal investigator with John Whyte here at Moss as the co-PI. And it started out as a project with the three of us that you see here today at Moss, as well as Tessa Hart, and then three researchers at Mount Sinai. And we wrapped that up. We put a lot of the concepts that are now in the RTSS, we kind of formed in that first cooperative agreement. And then from 2015 to 2018, John Whyte was the PI of a research contract with PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And so at this point, we took a lot of the principles that we had developed for the RTSS and helped to operationalize them. And that led to the RTSS manual. So that's available for download. That's sort of the definitive guide to operationalization of the RTSS. And we put out some articles as well. So this has been ongoing work for more than a dozen years now. That's the kind of history behind it. You can see the RTSS PCORI team for that most recent grant was the four of us at Moss Rehab. And then there were individuals from around the country and Lynn Turkstra in Canada. And you can also see we had, on that project, we had two physical therapists, two occupational therapists, two speech language pathologists. So very purposely wanted to represent all of rehab, as well as John Whyte and Tessa Hart, the neuropsychologist, Marcel as a rehabilitation researcher. So this is a system that's been a long time coming. And the major goal today is to kind of let you know about some of the impact it's had so far and some of the ways it's being used. We're going to provide a very brief overview of the RTSS. I think at this point, hopefully, a lot of people listening to this have had some exposure to it. If this is your first introduction to the RTSS, after this overview, you will not feel fluent in the concepts and fluent in using the RTSS, but hopefully you'll at least be intrigued enough and want to learn more about it, and we can provide resources for that. So the importance of the RTSS, why this project was undertaken in the first place, is that we would argue that it's critical to understand better about what occurs in rehabilitation. So this has been referred to as the black box of rehabilitation. We kind of see benefits for the RTSS in terms of three different areas: the research, clinical care, and again, you'll hear about research from John Whyte, and clinical care from Mary Ferraro, and then in education. So as we've kind of gotten these concepts out and we've talked about them with treating clinicians, we've also found that introducing it into educational settings as rehabilitation clinicians and researchers are just forming their educations can be very helpful. So again, a brief introduction to the RTSS. It's about treatment specification, and that can be a little vague in trying to figure out what that really means. Can be uncertain.
At first I was going to ask her a question.
Just a reminder, everyone, to go on mute, please. Sorry.
Yep. So the RTSS really talks about why we do what we do in rehab. We're going to start with that, and then what it is that we actually do in rehab and how we think we do it. So we're going to kind of go through that as we look into the RTSS. So why what we do in rehab? The RTSS asks you to consider for the treatment that you're thinking about, what is the direct proximal effect that you're intending to have with that treatment? So some very specific thing that you're trying to affect with the particular treatment you're considering, and we identify that as the target of treatment. So that's perhaps the most important concept in the RTSS, is identifying this target of treatment as the specific thing you're trying to impact with that specific treatment you're providing is the target of treatment. And the RTSS differentiates that from distal effects or other effects that your treatment may have. So we term those other distal effects enablement theory, and that's not directly what the RTSS is involved with. It recognizes that it's very important, but we're really focusing on the direct effect of the treatment, not some wider effect. So we can look at that, what that might look like. In this hypothetical chart, you can see on the left, we have different levels of the ICF from body structure, body function, activity, up to participation. And we would refer to this as an enablement map. So at the bottom level, under body obstruction, we may be working with a patient who had a spinal cord injury, and so some destruction of spinal cord tracts. These may lead to deficits in sensation and motor function, which may interfere with the ability to drive or operate a computer, which may then interfere with employment and parenting. So the enablement idea is kind of looking at the linkages between all these boxes. So the enablement concepts are represented by the arrows shown here. The enablement theory predicts that if you have deficits in sensation, it may interfere with driving or with operating a computer. But what the RTSS really focuses on is the inside of each individual box. So the RTSS asks you to think about, if you want to make a change in someone's sensation, what do you need to do? If you want to directly change someone's motor functioning, what do you need to do? Or you could directly try to impact someone's driving ability. So that's the focus of the RTSS, is within those individual boxes. The complementary piece is this enablement piece, which hypothesizes that if you change one level on this map, you may get changes in a different level. So that's the quick description of enablement theory versus what we would call treatment theory, is the direct focus of the RTSS. Now, when we talk about the RTSS and we try to specifically investigate the effects of individual treatments, we have to start with the idea that the term treatment, as we use in clinical language, can mean a variety of different things. So treatment could describe a whole course of inpatient rehabilitation treatment. It could describe a number of sessions. It could describe an hour-long session. So we break down in the RTSS, we break down that term treatment into different pieces where we've identified distinct targets. And we'll talk about what we call those. But the first step in identifying treatments and breaking them down in the RTSS is identifying what you think you're impacting for each particular target that you're working on. So the next question to the RTSS is what we do in rehab. Why we're doing it is to impact those treatment targets. What will the clinician do to make that change for that particular treatment target? So the RTSS, if everyone can remember to mute, we're getting some static. The RTSS identifies what the clinician is going to do to make the change in the target as ingredients, specific actions, words, objects, anything that the clinician is putting into play to make that change in the target can be ingredients. So there are a wide variety of ingredients that we use. If we manipulate the environment and set it up in a certain way, we use a lot of different devices, aids, different strategies that the therapist puts into practice, maybe ingredients. If we're performing mechanical type treatments or thermal electrical treatments, those may be different ingredients that we've used. We do a lot of instructing, coaching, physical cueing or guidance. Those are types of ingredients. Again, there's a large quantity, but anything that the therapist feels is important that they're putting into play to help make that change in the target are going to be identified as ingredients within the RTSS. And then the RTSS doesn't just focus necessarily on a particular session. We can think about the way that the therapist may plan to change ingredients across the session. So dosing parameters, schedules of practice or repetition or reinforcement. We know, for example, in a strengthening treatment that typically over time, you're going to want to increase the resistance of a muscle that a muscle has to lift. So we think that progression is an important part of the ingredient. And then in skill training, we talk about some different generalization parameters, how specific you think that skill should be generalized, and the ingredients may change depending upon that piece. So that's the what the clinician is doing, and then how we think we do it. So we have the question we have when we're putting those ingredients into practice, how do those ingredients make that change in the target? And we identify that as the mechanism of action, is how we think that treatment is expected to work, what connects the ingredients that the clinician is putting into play to the target that they're trying to change. And then we refer to this package of ingredients leading through a mechanism of action to make the change in a single individual target as a treatment component. So when we said that the RTSS can take what we identify as one clinical treatment and break it down according to different targets, we break that larger treatment into individual treatment components. And each treatment component has a single target and then its associated ingredients and mechanism of action. Now, once we've got that structure, what the RTSS has identified that all treatment components, which really means that everything we do in rehabilitation, we believe, can be sorted into 3 different types of groups. So the one group is organ functions, when we're looking to change some type of functioning of an organ. And this is a pretty diverse group. It includes strengthening type treatments, wound care, integumentary, exercise-based treatments to change the cardiovascular system, for example, anything where we're looking to change an organ function. The skills and habits group is anything that is improved by practice. So we've recognized that across rehabilitation in different settings and different disciplines, there's a lot of sort of practice-based treatment goes on where the goal of the clinician is to get the patient, the individual, to practice something to improve. So that would all fill into that skills and habits treatment. When we look at the mechanism here, we recognize that we don't have a great understanding. What is the mechanism? How does practice lead to improved skill. So, the best way we have of identifying this mechanism is learning by doing, but at least we know there is a consistent relationship there. We know that when people do get the right kind of practice, they do make a change in their skills. So there's an established association there, even if we can't be more specific about what that actual mechanism of action is. And then the third group is representations. This has to do with a lot of educational type treatments where we think about changing knowledge, but also changing attitudes, beliefs, and motivation would all fall in this representations category. So again, we think those three categories can help identify everything that we do in rehabilitation, and we can group it cleanly into one of those three categories. The last thing to review in terms of the RTSS and some key principles is this idea about volition. So the RTSS has established that volition is a critically important piece of rehabilitation, and therefore an important piece of the RTSS. And what we mean by volition here is effort or active engagement of the patient. And this reflects the fact that most of the things we do in rehabilitation, we don't really do to patients, but we do with patients. We need to get them engaged and involved in the treatments we're providing. So this is where this volition comes in. Volition of the patient is required for every skills and habits treatment and representations treatment. So in order to make a change in skill or habit, the patient has to practice. They have to be engaged. They have to be doing that activity. To make a change in the representations, they at least need to be attending and receiving information to be able to make that change. We know that volition is required for some organ treatments, but actually some of those are passive. So if I'm stretching somebody's muscle, I can do that passively without their volition. So volition is what's required of the patient for certain treatments in the RTSS. And then we also use the word volition in the RTSS to refer to volition ingredients. So volition ingredients are things that the clinician can add to treatments to increase the patient's motivation or engagement. So prompting statements, reinforcement, encouragement, some type of reward. Feedback can be a type of volition ingredient if it's used to increase the patient's motivation and engagement. So that is the quick, very brief intro to the RTSS. And then John Whyte will be taking us through 2 uses of the RTSS in research.
Thanks, Andy. So, when we developed this system, we argued that it would have important benefits for clinical practice, for research, and for education. And I think we experienced a fair amount of enthusiasm from all of those audiences as we rolled out some of the concepts of the RTSS, but all of those audiences also said that there were many obstacles to implementing the RTSS in those domains. And so our work now is focused very heavily on trying to understand what those obstacles are and help figure out ways to overcome them. But I have to say that we're used to hearing about how long and slow it is for anything that's developed in research to make its way into clinical implementation. I've been positively surprised by the degree of uptake of what is really a very complicated system over the last few years. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of the early adoptions of RTSS, specifically in the area of research. Next, Andy. So first of all, let's talk about how the RTSS can be beneficial in research design. So as Andy mentioned, the RTSS requires you to separate your treatment into potentially multiple treatment components, each of which has a measurable target. And it requires you to overtly articulate the treatment theory that predicts each of those target changes. So what are those targets? What ingredients are linked to changing each of those targets, and why do you think those ingredients should do that job? That's what you have to say. And because Andy also pointed out this distinction between treatment theory and enablement theory, RTSS requires us to distinguish between targets, which should definitely change if the ingredients are effective, and aims, which might change if you're right about enablement theory, about assumptions about how strength is related to driving, is related to parenting, and all those complicated relationships. But clearly, you should have a firmer prediction about target change than aim change. Now, because RTSS requires you to do that, it, in principle, could allow you to pick an outcome measure for every target that you're treating in your study. You don't have to do that, but you have the ability to link a specific outcome measure for every single target. And then if you also think that there will be some aggregate impact of all of the treatment components on some larger aim, then you can select an outcome measure to measure that larger aim as well. And now you have the ability to see if you don't achieve the larger aim, is it because you failed to achieve some of the targets, or is it because your prediction about how those targets were related to that larger aim might have been incorrect. Next, Andy. So I'm going to give you an example of how this was used after the fact to critique a particular study. The study that's listed on top here was a recently published randomized controlled trial of a cognitive rehabilitation intervention for individuals with concussion. It was published in Brain. It was viewed as a rigorous clinical trial. And then Lynn Turkstra and I were asked to write an editorial that sort of critiqued this study through the lens of the RTSS. And next slide, please. Just briefly to describe the study. So the investigators posited that one of the things that happens in concussion is slowed information processing, and that if people got a set of computerized activities that demand fast processing, and they practice them over and over, that this would lead to improvement in cognitive function, in ADL performance that was timed, and ultimately in symptoms, post-concussion symptoms. And they didn't, of course, articulate things in the way we would have liked. They didn't specifically say, they said about the activities that people practiced on the computer that they adapted to their performance. So they got harder as they got better. And that they demanded attention, that they were rewarding and provided game-like rewards, and that they were in multiple different domains, visual, auditory, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now when you start thinking about that, since they argued that really the main thing they hoped to change was speed of processing, we would be inclined to think of that as the target of this intervention. But just one little problem. We're not told what the speed demands are of the 23 activities that were part of the experimental condition, and we're not clearly shown that the activities that are part of the control condition didn't require speeded processing. We're also not told how many different domains of cognitive processing you need to practice in order to become generally faster in your brain. We just know that they did a bunch of different activities. Furthermore, clearly they tested a bunch of cognitive outcomes using an electronic neuropsych testing battery and predicted improvement in these, but these measures weren't selected to be particularly sensitive to speeded processing. So implicitly, they must be saying, well, even if it's not a speeded task, if you process faster, you'll do better. But then what they did find was improvement in the cognitive battery, no improvement in the timed ADL test, and no improvement in symptoms. Well, why would training that made people faster make them faster on cognitive tests, but not on ADL performance? And what was done to treat any of the other cognitive domains that are also relevant to these tasks. It's not only speed that's relevant, but visual spatial processing, memory, whatever. So the point is, when you start looking at this through the lens of RTSS, you say, if they had the treatment theory they had, we would have wanted a measure of speed of processing, and we would have wanted to see that change. We would have wanted to know that the activities in the active treatment group push people a lot more on speed than in the other group. And we would want to know how the selection of the content of those exercises maps onto the cognitive tests that were ultimately done, since it seems like something more than just speed was what was at issue. This doesn't help us with the study that's already been done, but it helps, I think it helps illustrate that were we to do this study over again, we would do quite a few things differently. Next, please. Now, in addition to helping you design research and pick the right outcome measures, there's the question of how we read or interpret published evidence. How do we know what aspects of a treatment that we read about that's effective should be replicated? Do we have enough information to perform that treatment in practice? And when we have multiple different studies of what sound like similar treatments, can we aggregate the evidence across multiple trials? So those are the kinds of tasks we need to be able to do to make progress with the evidence. If you think about it, it's quite rare that treatment advances are achieved from a single excellent trial. It's much more common that multiple studies are done in a topic area, and over time, we aggregate the results of those studies through some sort of meta-analysis or synthetic review or whatever. So that requires that we have positive results in several studies of the same or similar treatment, that we do this kind of formal analysis where we aggregate the evidence, and then we end up with a recommendation to adopt that improved treatment. And then, of course, we could go on to the next step and say, if it's tough to get people to adopt it, what kinds of barriers and facilitators get in the way of adopting something that we know to be desirable to adopt? But the first two steps here, having several studies of the same or similar treatment that are positive and looking at whether the results are consistent across studies, require us to be able to tell which studies are of the same or similar treatments and how what they did about those same or similar treatments differed from study to study. In other words, we can't do that kind of work when each of those studies is just a black box of treatment. And I've told some of you about an example that I was exposed to some years ago when I was asked to critique a synthetic review of memory remediation treatments. They wanted a single conclusion of whether the evidence supported memory remediation or didn't. And they looked at everything that was called memory remediation, which included beepers to remind you to keep appointments, notebooks to document what you did so you can tell your family members, a photo camera that took pictures of what you did that you could review. I mean, so basically, the targets of these interventions were often different and the ingredients were often different, and yet they were being grouped together to ask one question about efficacy, which made no sense. Next, please. So what would we need to do differently in order to make this kind of evidence aggregation more viable? Well, it would help if people articulated the treatment theories underlying their treatment so that they specified the targets and which ingredients were linked to each target, and also told us about any distal aims, like in the cognitive rehab example. Symptoms are very distal to questions of speeded processing. And then to select measures of the treatment and its hypothesized outcomes that would allow you to compare it to other studies. And then people who are trying to aggregate evidence would need to look at a bunch of different treatments and say, well, do they have the same treatment components? Oh, they overlap in these skills and habits, but this motivational intervention was present in this treatment, but not that treatment, and so on and so forth, and then identify treatment components that are specific to particular treatments, and in that way know it's not plausible that two treatments that have different names should differ in some way when they completely overlap in ingredients. So we have to first find out whether the contents are different or similar in order to know what to compare. Next. Now, there are two recent projects that have bearing on this issue of evidence reporting and evidence aggregation. A group called Cochrane Rehab has been working on developing a reporting guideline specifically for the field of rehabilitation. And then NINDS and NICHD, along with the Curing Coma campaign, have been attempting to develop common data elements for treatment research. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of these. Let's start with the Cochrane Rehab. So Cochrane Rehab has been interested in developing a reporting guideline that is a guide that people who are planning to publish treatment studies are supposed to follow in structuring their manuscript, and one that is more well-suited to the field of rehabilitation. And so if you start from probably the most broadly accepted reporting guideline, CONSORT, the Consolidated Statement on Reporting Trials, what it says about treatment is the interventions for each group should be reported with sufficient details to allow replication, including how and when they were actually administered. But of course, that leaves it completely up to the judgment of the investigator as to what are sufficient details. And we know from a lot of clinicians reading these articles that what investigators think are sufficient details, clinicians usually think are insufficient details for them to adopt the treatment. Now, there is a somewhat more specific reporting guideline called TIDIER, Template for Intervention Description and Replication, which has more specific prompts such as what was done in treatment, who did the treatment, when and how much of the thing was done, but still doesn't give us any operational guidance about which materials and actions are critical. What attributes of the treating clinician do we need to be concerned about, and how the heck do we measure how much? Is that the length of the treatment session in hours? I hope not. Next. Cochrane Rehab wanted to develop, as I said, a rehab-specific reporting guideline. They organized work groups around each of the main dimensions of the CONSORT guideline, such as enrollment, randomization, study design, study treatment, and so on. And our interest group at ACRM was asked to take on the topic of description of the study treatment via a scoping review. And that scoping review was published recently in the archive, in the American Journal of Physical Medicine and Rehab. Next. So we started with the TIDIER framework as our backbone because it is already more detailed about non-pharmacologic treatments than CONSORT. And then our group reviewed all of the reporting guidelines that have been posted on the Equator website from all domains of intervention. So public health intervention, homeopathy, needle treatments, vibration, electrical stimulation, you name it. And what we did was in reviewing each of those existing reporting guidelines, we were looking for content about reporting the treatment that might help us do it better in rehabilitation. And so for each of those other guidelines, we asked for each TIDIER item, did they address that topic at all or not? If they addressed it, did they address it no better and no worse than TIDIER? Or did they expand on, make more specific, or improve on a TIDIER reporting item? Next. And the really interesting broad finding was that there were some guidelines that were attempting to cover a very broad domain of treatment reporting. And when that was the case, they tended to be very open-ended, like describe the details needed to replicate. But there were other guidelines that were developed for very focused areas of treatment, neuromodulation, homeopathy, and so on, exercise. They tended to provide very specific lists of treatment attributes that should be described. So I'm going to get back to our recommendations about what to do about that, but that was a key finding as we looked at the existing reporting guidelines. Next. And just to give you some examples, so here's a tidier item to describe each of the procedures, activities, and or processes used in the intervention. And then if somebody's putting out a guideline on electrical stimulation, it's way more specific. Tell us the duration, the frequency, the measured current, the placement of the electrodes on the body, the size and geometry of the electrodes, and the voltage amplitude. And similarly, in acupuncture, we have very specific guidance. And we saw this over and over for each of the tidier items, that when the domain of focus was relatively restricted, it became possible to be much more specific in the recommendations. Why? Because in each of these focused areas, we have some consensus about the treatment theory. How does acupuncture work? And therefore, what do we need to capture about your acupuncture session to know whether it was similar to someone else's acupuncture session? Next. I'm going to move on to the other project, and then I'll come back about some general conclusions. So the Common Data Elements project from NIH. There's been a broad CDE effort promoted by NIH over the last 15 years or so that's intended to encourage investigators to use the same measures to characterize patient attributes and treatment outcomes across studies. And the idea is, if a bunch of people are studying interventions for depression, wouldn't it be nice if they all used the same depression outcome measure so we could more easily compare their results? So it's intended specifically to facilitate aggregation of evidence and formal meta-analyses. And the typical process that's been used to develop CDEs has been to convene experts to agree on two things. One, what are the domains that we need measurement in? And then what's the best measure or measures for each of those domains? So, there might be in outcome areas, there might be mobility, self-care, mental health, and then there would be the question of what's the best measure of mobility, the best measure of mental health, and so on and so forth. And then the net result is that new investigators are recommended to use one of those CDEs unless they have a compelling reason to measure things in a different way. Next. Well, up until now, CDEs have been developed for attributes of the patient, sort of severity indicators and premorbid indicators and so on, and for the outcome domains of interest. But they have not previously been developed for treatment. And so NIH decided that they wanted to develop CDEs for treatment. Couple different groups sought to do this, and both groups, which I was involved with, encountered the same challenges. The most broadly applicable potential CDEs are hours of treatment with a specific discipline. So everybody knows how to measure those, but nobody really thinks that they're worth measuring. More specific CDEs, as I mentioned, can be articulated for very specific treatments, but these may not be seen in enough studies to make them common in the notion of common data elements. And if you think about it, what active ingredients of treatment are broadly measurable across all treatments? It's not even really a very logical question because the active ingredients are so varied. The bottom line in both of these committee activities was that none of the participants thought that they would use any of the draft CDEs that were put forward because we thought none of them were actually informative or useful. So what should we do if we can't do CDEs? Next. And out of those two projects together come a common set of emerging recommendations. So think about, for CDEs, constructs like injury severity and depression are latent traits. You can't measure directly anyone's depression, you infer it from their answers to specific questions. But treatment ingredients, in principle, can be measured directly. I can measure how much weight you were given to lift. The problem is, which things should be measured directly, and are they the same across treatments? So our ultimate recommendation is that early in treatment development, investigators have to define the attributes of treatment that are relevant to report, but those are the known or hypothesized active ingredients. So we need the investigator to be in charge, but we need to give the investigator structure to tell them that they have to divide their treatment into treatment components, clearly articulate the treatment theories. That allows us to debate the treatment theories that they're pursuing and also the measures that they chose of those treatment effects. As a treatment domain matures, though, and there's a volume of research being done on a given area of treatment, now there can be some expert consensus among investigators in that treatment domain, and they can put together CDEs like the more specific examples that I gave you from our scoping review. Next. The final question that we encountered in the NIH effort was, how do we decide when an area of research is ready for common data elements, ready for that more focused kind of operational definition? And we made a recommendation, we will have to see whether NIH adopts this recommendation, that this could be solved by a funding mechanism. That is, there could be a funding mechanism for the purpose of developing consensus-based CDEs around treatment. And what you need to apply for that funding is to show that there's been some significant work in that area already, so that there is some knowledge. There's variations in how people are reporting treatments in that domain that need to be straightened out. You know who the key players in that domain are who should participate, and you have a way to get them to reach consensus. And in that way, we would let the field tell us when early treatment theories have coalesced into some consensus that warrants more specific treatment definitions along that kind of operationalized formula. Next. So in summary, I think the RTSS can play an important role in enhancing both the design and the aggregation and synthesis of evidence in rehab. But to do that on the research side will require changes in behavior on the part of researchers, journal editors, and funders. And so our big task is prioritizing the different implementation strategies going forward. And I will now turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit about the clinical side.
Thanks, John. So I just wanted to briefly mention some of the efforts we've had here at Moss to talk about the RTSS and bring it to clinical practice. And this came about mostly because of Andy and I being on the grant and feeling as though the development of the grant and the ability to articulate theory, how it matches up to the ingredients that can cause a change, was really valuable for your clinical thinking, and it helped to separate and clarify the efforts that clinicians put out. So next. So after the grant ended, Andy was awarded an Einstein Society grant where we tried to put some of these RTSS concepts out in the clinic. We chose 2 inpatient units here at Moss, and on each unit there was a complement of OT, PT, and speech, and devoted time to training those clinicians about RTSS concepts, and in the hopes that the clinicians, it would help them specify their treatments to a little bit more in more detail, and that communication would not only help in their delivery of treatment, but would also assist in communication, because there's a lot of trade-offs of communication and between clinicians, whether it's weekend coverage or staff vacancies or transition to another site. And in all of those cases, it felt as though it was very relevant to put what ingredients the therapist has to deliver and what they're trying to change. Go ahead, Andy. The lessons learned, though, and this first one seems pretty obvious, and we left it at the top only to say that despite having a grant with funding to cover clinicians, it's just not enough to cover the complexity of a dynamic clinic environment. Clinicians are busy, and you're not only adding, even though you have a coverage person, you're still adding more complexity to a very dynamic situation of staffing and scheduling. And it was sometimes hard to wedge more into that busy day. We started with the manual, and that may have been a tough start because the manual was a little dense and it overwhelmed people with the complexity in the language. And we found that once we delved into actually talking about cases, clinicians rallied around those concepts. But initially, I think the manual was a little bit overwhelming. We definitely encountered clinicians feeling a need to translate their thinking from the kind of usual short and long-term goals toward targets and aims and ingredients. And while I think all the content was in there, the terminology complicated things a little bit, especially for the weekend clinicians who needed to come in and kind of assess and use some of that RTSS language and try to apply it in a kind of shortened and brief settings. The other confound, where we, again, talking about coverage, was that sometimes the compliance of a clinician when covering a treatment session was not always directly in line with the paper. So clinicians do vary in their adherence to the coverage sheet, totally separate from the RTSS concepts. So there were several factors that really made this, showed the complexity of documentation and how documentation guides clinical decision-making. But I will say that in some of the cases, I think the clinicians found that the RTSS concepts were very helpful in talking out what they were doing with a patient, what they were trying to change in that session, and how they were delivering it, and whether their ingredients facilitated that change. And that nugget gave us some encouragement about the use of the RTSS. And we were kind of encouraged to find other ways to put it into practice. Next. So where we went was toward our advanced practice programs. And some of you may know that we have 3 advanced practice programs. We have an OT fellowship in physical rehab. We have a PT neuro residency and a PT ortho residency. And these are clinicians with licenses who come for a 1 year of more advanced curriculum and mentoring. And they all start in July. So we have 5 new staff join us every July across PT and OT, and they participate in clinical activities with our experienced staff who are established as mentors and will guide their participation and oversee their treatment. And these clinicians are good messengers, I'll say, about the RTSS, because the RTSS, using this with the advanced practice programs, provided a structure for these clinicians to talk about their treatments, and they brought the words of the RTSS into their mentored sessions because we inserted some of the language of RTSS on those forms. Next. So we made some, over the past few years, we've kind of upped the ante with the involvement of the RTSS. And so now we have made deliberate attempts to train the mentors, of which there are nearly 30 staff across several different sites. These are experienced staff who provide mentorship to these advanced practice folks. And we've made some direct attempts to train and expose the mentors to RTSS concepts. We've put RTSS language into the mentor forms, and we hope that that structure can be used in their weekly exercises and assignments. In addition, asking these, oh no, it's fine, Andy. In addition, asking the therapist to specify their treatments becomes good fodder for discussion about what they're doing and why. And so we've kind of built from their specifications, good discussions about what are you trying to change in your treatment? Do your ingredients match that change? Next. So during these discussions, we've asked the clinicians, it's kind of sparked good discussion about what they're doing and why they made those discussions and those decisions, and ensuring that the ingredients align to make the change in the target that they've documented. And sometimes I think what the comments that we've heard is that the structure, first of all, is helpful across the board, regardless of discipline, regardless of diagnosis. Everyone can speak about what a therapist is trying to change in a session and define that target with some aspect of functioning. But it also especially has been beneficial for patients who have complexities of treatment, and where you really, the RTS can help you break out what you're trying to do and state targets in clear ways that can help people facilitate and break down their treatments and ensure that things are in alignment. I will say, next slide, because I want to leave some time for discussion, that one thing is we've learned that the RTSS needs to be practiced. There's only so much I think you can benefit as a clinician from reading about it. It's really best to take some stabs at trying to identify and articulate your targets and articulate the ingredients you plan to deliver. That there are some very basic concepts about ensuring things match up and the treatment groups, and using some of these concepts about volition ingredients and separating the engagement of the patient as separate from their actual completion of the exercises, that I think is really helpful for clinicians to think about and build on the treatment principles that they want to conduct in the clinic. I definitely will say, though, that it does require a little bit of extra effort, and to some degree we need to sell the system a little bit. It doesn't come naturally yet, although I think we've had a few people say to us, you know, if I had learned this in the beginning when I was just becoming a therapist, it might be a little easier for me to adopt. But there is right now a little bit of a translation feature. But I think the principles do help a clinician think through things, and we've certainly had anecdotal support for it to be a good kind of go-to structure when people want to reconsider or just examine what they're doing in practice. And we're hoping that it helps with their clinical reasoning in general. I wanted to also just leave you with the idea that after this grant ended, a treatment specification group, a networking group, was established at ACRM. It is the Treatment Specification Networking Group. This is now a group of the clinicians from all over and all different disciplines who care about this topic and have kind of devising different ways to use it in clinical education, in clinical practice, as well as research. If you go to this website, Andy, next slide, there is a link to download the manual. And as I said, it's a little bit, it's extensive and it's a little deep, but it does outline all of the aspects of the RTSS and the concepts. And it's the current state of our understanding of this work, although it continues to be a work in progress. So I anticipate some modifications in the future. Next. That's it. That leaves a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Bravo, thank you to the whole panel. That was very comprehensive. I could talk about this all afternoon with you. I think it's probably good if you stop sharing your screen and look for raised hands. We just have several minutes, I think, left for questions. I'll need to drop off at 1. Thank you.
Any questions or comments, folks?
I guess while we're waiting, then could I jump in quickly? I was wondering to the extent that when one analyzes the treatment, the ingredients that they think are inside a treatment, are they the best person to make? The assumption is that they're the best person to make a judge of that, and I'm wondering whether an external analysis of somebody else's treatment, like an independent analysis or audit, might be illuminative.
Well, I'll make one comment. I guess, first of all, I think you can take that question either in terms of treatment theory or in terms of sort of treatment adherence. So I think what we're really asking is for the person who is designing a treatment, whether that be a clinician or a researcher, to declare their hypothesis. So they can be wrong. And we can critique them and we can argue with it, but we can't do any of that if they haven't articulated it clearly. So I do think that the investigator or the clinician needs to be the person who puts out why they're doing what they're doing, and in a clear enough form that we can argue about it. But the second issue is, having told me what you're what you think you're doing, does your behavior conform to that? Are you delivering the ingredients reliably that you say you are? And that, I agree with you that we still need measures of adherence, but now we have the ability to target those measures because you've told us what ingredients are critical to deliver. Those are the ones I better find good adherence for. And I'll just, one final thing is that on several occasions, we've tried to do studies where we just document ingredients from observation without asking the clinician what they're doing or trying to do. And that's very hard, especially if you're looking at a single session, because you can't tell whether they said that thing incidentally in passing or they said that thing because it's a strategy of how they're motivating a person for another session. Over multiple sessions, you might see, oh, they consistently deliver a motivational message before they start a practice trial, but we really do need some access into the head of the clinician or investigator to know what their theory is. It's not all visible from direct observation. Andy or Mary, you want to add to?
I mean, I'll just say as we got into our project with clinicians, Mary and I had a few opportunities at the beginning of the project where we got a written description of what the therapist was intending to work on with the patient. And then we observed the treatment session, and we tried to pick out where there were ingredients they could identify for us in their written description. And then could we identify those ingredients? And I think, there were a lot of assumptions. We were kind of like, well, I think they're doing this for that reason, but there certainly wasn't a lot of things that I think were really objective and evident that we could help to line up. And that was before use of the RTSS. I think hopefully after using the RTSS, maybe somebody could better identify their ingredients, and then we might have better success, but we didn't get to do that at this point.
I guess we are out of time. So we'd be happy if anyone wants to follow up by email or whatever, but thank you all for attending today.
Wonderful.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks. Great
That was terrific.
presentation.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.